Hey guys, Mr. Kramer here, and today I will be presenting our third section notes, which is evidence of evolution. And what we'll see here in a second are the I can statements, and you'll notice that this is one of the bigger I can statements of the unit. And so what I've done is I've split this I can statement up into two different presentations. So there are four pieces of evidence that we're going to cover. We're going to cover two in this video and two in another video. So let's go ahead and get started. Here are I can statements. Number 7, we may or may not have time for, so we're just going to focus on number 4 right now. All the ones with the check marks we've already covered. And so number 4 says, describe the evidence used by Darwin to develop the theory of evolution by natural selection. And notice that in the I can statement, it does say by Darwin. Now, 150, 160 years later after Darwin, DNA is also provided a really excellent source of or piece of evidence for evolution. But we're going to set that aside. We know that we can sequence DNA of these different organisms to see how related they are. We're only going to focus on the pieces of evidence that Darwin wrote about in his book. And so before we jump into those pieces of evidence, I think it'd be a good idea to review what we've done this unit. And so I have 4 questions here, and I would like for you to take a couple minutes to see if you can answer these questions. You can write them down. I think that'd be a great idea, just into your notebook or directly into your unit booklet. You can just think about them too if you would like. Obviously, you want to be thinking, can I answer these? And if I can't answer these, what's my plan to figure them out? Maybe it's just you have to go back and look at your notes, or maybe you have to ask a question in class or during lunch or something like that. So I'm just going to stop talking for a little bit, and that's going to give you the opportunity to just push pause. We'll have a little bit of a small break. And then after that break, I will go over the answer. So here is me not talking for 5 seconds. Go ahead and push pause if you need. Okay, hopefully you push pause before my fingers reach 5. Let's go over that first one. Can you name and describe the 4 parts of Darwin's theory of evolution, with extra bonus if you can provide examples specifically from the video that we watched. So let's go through them real quick. It's number 1, overproduction. Number 2, genetic variation. Number 3, the struggle for existence. And number 4, survival of the fittest. And so overproduction, organisms are going to produce more offspring than are going to reach sexual maturity. We saw a really just extraordinary example with the giant Pacific octopus laying 100,000 eggs. But this also happens with dogs, for instance. Dogs will have 6, 7 dogs, 8 dogs in a litter. Typically, not all 8 of those dogs, and certainly not all 100,000 octopuses are going to make it to sexual maturity. So that's overproduction. The second part is genetic variation. We know from what we learned back in Unit 6 and even into Unit 7 that offspring within a population, even from the same parents, are going to have differences because of what happens in meiosis and because of random mutations. And those differences are going to allow a variety of traits. I know this wasn't from the video, but we saw in the natural selection simulation that our birds were changing. That allowed, with random mutations, that allowed our birds to hopefully survive and evolve over time. Hopefully your bird population's made it to 1 million years. The third part is the struggle for existence. The environment is going to make it really, really hard to live long enough. You have to find food, not be food, find a mate, water, disease. If you're a tree or a plant, you have to compete for sunlight, you have to compete for water in the soil, nutrients in the soil. And if you don't have adaptations, if you can't adapt fast enough, you're not going to get those essential things that you need. Then you'll die. And we saw this from the cheetahs hunting the ostriches, finding a new behavior. We saw the capuchin monkeys over time developing behaviors that they could eat the palm nuts. We saw the dolphins, the Florida Keys doing the mud ringing technique to catch fish. We saw the stalk-eyed fly having some adaptations to push air into its stalk so it can attract a mate. We saw the hippopotamus battling for a mate. I mean, the list goes on and on. So anything in an environment that makes it tough not only to live but then also to mate and pass on genes would be an environmental pressure. That's the struggle for existence. And the last one is survival of the fittest. So the organism that has the best accumulation of traits is the one that's most likely to pass on its genes. Obviously, there are things that some organisms can't control. It's happened 5 times in Earth's history that there has been something that's caused a mass extinction where 75% of all species were decimated, and large numbers of organisms in a population died as well, but some survived. And so what we saw in the video were organisms that have an amazing collection of adaptations, like the cheetahs again, for example. They were able to figure enough things out that they could survive, and then hopefully you would think that those cheetahs were able to mate and pass on their genes, but the video didn't show that, but you would think, oh, they found a meal. That increases their likelihood of getting to the point where they will be able to pass on their genes if they haven't. So those are the 4 parts. That's a big part of what we're doing in this unit. So it's good to know those. We're going to go through the last 3 very quickly. So here we go. Adaptations are any trait that helps an organism survive in its environment. And fitness is the likelihood that an organism will survive and pass on its genes. It's how well can an organism get to sexual maturity, and then how well can it help its offspring pass on its genes to even future generations. Usually adaptations lead to higher fitness. The more beneficial adaptations there are, the higher the fitness of the organism. What determines adaptations favorable? That's the environment. We talked about that in number 1. And then that scientist, his name was Alfred Wallace. Alfred Wallace, he was another British naturalist. He went on 2 voyages to Indonesia. He had to go on a second one because the first one he lost all of his specimens. His ship caught on fire. Luckily, he survived. But he wrote an essay to Darwin, 1858, I want to say, somewhere around there, just before Darwin decided to publish his book, saying, this is what I've noticed. Darwin was like, yeah, man, I did that 20 years ago. And Wallace ended up getting co-author credits on Darwin's book on the origin of species. So it was definitely, they weren't rivals at all. They were collaborators. And yeah, if it wasn't for Darwin, we would be learning all about Wallace. Anyways, now that we're there, let's go ahead and get into these pieces of evidence. Hopefully you're good with the review. I've told you from the beginning of the unit, you are allowed to believe whatever it is that you believe. And by no means do I want to tell you what's right and what's wrong and this is how the world works. I think you get to interpret that for yourself. But according to the scientific theory and to what Darwin said, all organisms would have had to have evolved from the very first one. That's the only way that it could have happened. So how the first cell got on this earth, nobody knows. But the fossil record says that the first cell appeared on the earth around 3.8 billion years ago. The earth is only about 4.56 billion years old. So it wasn't even a billion years old when the first cell appeared. How the first cell got here, Darwin doesn't attempt to explain. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. There are some theories, but it was a prokaryote, which makes sense. So a very, very simple cell. But after about a billion years of prokaryotic evolution, eukaryotes appeared on the planet. And then after a few more billion years, we had the first simple multicellular organisms. And then evolution just kind of took off. And you can see that everything would have had to have been connected to that very, very first cell. This is the origin of life here. That very, very first cell, whether it's plants, animals, fungi, it doesn't matter. Everything would have gone back to that very first cell, which would be every living species' common ancestor. And we have an estimated 8 million different species on this planet, with probably millions more that have been undiscovered. But they all would have descended from that first cell. And so here are some pieces of evidence that help show that. Okay, so let's look at our first piece of evidence, and that's fossils. Before we do, I went ahead and turned off the camera. Sometimes it covers up the little picture, covers up some things I didn't want to cover up. So for the rest of the slides up until the last one, we'll have the camera off. But our first piece of evidence are fossils, and fossils are any remains of a once living thing. Fossils can look very different. Very rarely will you find like an actual piece of a living thing. It does happen, but it's the most rare type of fossil. Living things, especially the soft body parts, they break down, they decompose. So typically what you're looking at is like an imprint of a living thing into a stone, or other types of fossils will be like if a living thing dies and it creates this space or a cavity that fills with minerals, you'll get a rock in the shape of whatever that space left behind by a living thing was. If you're really interested in fossils, we do an entire unit on them in geology. We go through all the types of fossils and all that good stuff. So let's just talk about them very briefly and how they help serve as a piece of evidence for natural selection, evolution. So what fossils do is they provide paleontologists, biologists, geologists, whomever's looking at them. They show which organisms once lived on the earth. What was here in the past, and if you know what was here in the past, you can get an idea of what the climate was like. If you know what the climate was like, well, maybe that means that continent shouldn't have been there. It's kind of crazy, but fossils are also a really key piece of evidence for continental drift, the idea that all the continents were once together in Pangaea and then have since drifted apart. It's probably the best piece of evidence for the theory of continental drift, probably the best piece of evidence for evolution through natural selection. So there's two ways that you can measure the age of fossils, and I'll put up a couple things. These are ammonites. Ammonites lived on the earth for about 140 million years. They are ancient cephalopods. They're related to squid and octopus, and even if you go a little bit further down the evolutionary tree, they're related to other mollusks like snails, bivalves, clams, oysters, things like that. So one way that you can figure out how old the fossil is by finding its relative age. And the relative age is just how old is the fossil compared to other fossils. And I'll show you how that can be done. Now, if we want an exact age, like the fact that ammonites lived on the earth for 140 million years, then we need to do a different method of aging the fossil. But let's start with this relative age. So as geologists dig into the ground, they typically discover that the rocks are in these really organized layers for the most part. Now, sometimes they don't stay perfectly in these layers, but if they are in these layers, that's really great, because you know that any fossil found here in, let me turn on my laser pointer, any fossil found in A is going to be a younger fossil than if it was found in layer D. And you know that the oldest fossils would be found down here in layer G. And so that's just comparing fossils in one layer to another. It's not perfect because, like I said, sometimes the layers get messed up. Maybe there's erosion, or maybe there's like an earthquake and that changes the layers around, or maybe in this case there's like a volcano and lava pushes its way up into the layers, and then the lava will, over time, it won't reach the ground or the surface, but it will cool off into a younger rock. So it's not always perfect, but geologists found that the layers are pretty consistent. Like all of the layers in Europe are pretty consistent, and all of the layers in whatever region they're studying are pretty consistent for the most part. And so they can find fossils in one area of Europe and find fossils in another area of Europe and realize that, hey, well, this fossil's older than that one because it was found in a top layer as opposed to a layer that's deep. That's relative aging. Now, another way to find the age of fossils is to look at this is a little bit of chemistry, so I don't want to get too much into it, but essentially you can look at the chemicals, the elements that are inside of the rock that makes the fossil. And so some elements, they break down. It's just a natural process that they do. It's radioactivity. They break down, and they break down at very, very predictable rates. And so scientists can look at the amounts of some of those elements inside the rock, and using those amounts, they can figure out exactly how old the rock is, and therefore how old the fossil is. If you know how old the fossil is, you get a pretty good estimate about when that organism was on the earth. And so you can see some of the chemicals they use. Carbon-14 is really good, especially if they're looking at remains, like human remains, because the half-life is only 5,730 years. So it's really useful for 100 years to 30,000 years. If you're looking at really old stuff, you have to use something like potassium-40 or rubidium-87. So it depends on how old the fossil is the paleontologist or geologist or biologist is looking at, but they can get an idea pretty close within, even if it's within 1,000,000 years, that's pretty accurate about how old one of the fossils is and how long ago that organism lived on the earth. Let's take a look at some examples. So Darwin was in Argentina, what is now Argentina. He found fossils of a large armadillo organism called a glyptodon. Glyptodons are really interesting. So here is a picture of what the fossils that Darwin found in the 1820s, 1830s. And here is an actual intact armadillo skull. It's a replica, but this is what it would look like. And you can see there are some really similar parts. Like this jawbone is really similar to this jawbone fossil found. And Darwin noticed similarities of organisms in the fossil record to organisms that were living on the earth in his time, and organisms that were in the same areas that he was finding the fossils. He believed that the new species was a replacement to the extinct species that was in the same, he called it natural group, but essentially the same family. This was something that was really, really ahead of his time. He was actually connecting fossil species to current species. We call current species extant. Not extinct, extant, which means they're still on the earth. So he's connecting extinct and extant species and seeing similarities in their anatomy, in their bone structure, and different features. Just kind of a cool thing about the glyptodon. Glyptodons are interesting. So this fossil is an almost completely intact shell. Now again, it's made of rock, but it's an almost complete intact shell that was found in Argentina in 2015 by a farmer. It shows you how large a glyptodon was. Here, a glyptodon lived for 2 million to 11,000 years ago, and the reason they went extinct is because 11,000 years ago, our species hunted them to extinction, unfortunately. And glyptodons were huge. Large glyptodons could be over 3 meters in length and almost 1.5 meters tall. And I mean, we could put some of you on a glyptodon and ride it. It would be a really cool experience. Another cool example of fossils is the Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx lived 150 million years ago. Archaeopteryx are probably the transition species between the feathered dinosaurs, which, by the way, dinosaurs had feathers. That is now pretty well known that there were reptilian dinosaurs and feathered dinosaurs. But this was probably the species of dinosaur that led to the modern bird. The size was a little bit closer to the bird. The anatomy was a little bit closer to the bird. You can see in this fossil imprint, these streaks are actual feathers, which is really, really cool. And if you want to learn more about how dinosaurs led to extant species that are on the earth today, I will put this SciShow video on Moodle. Take a look at it. I think it's like 7 or 8 minutes, maybe 9 minutes long. It's a really cool talk about things like dino fuzz and how dinosaurs led to species that are on the earth today. Okay, before I show you one more fossil, I just want you to think about what was the most likely type of organism that amphibians evolved from. So like amphibians didn't just appear on the earth. They clearly didn't evolve from, like, say, prokaryotes. That wouldn't make much sense. Amphibians, if you think about it, probably evolved from fish. Amphibians spend a portion of their life in water. Frogs, for example, have their young, their tadpoles have gills. So they have some fish-like characteristics, I suppose. And this is important because Darwin believed in transition organisms. He believed that there were organisms that showed the transition from one type of organism to another. And he thought that those organisms could be found in the fossil record. He believed the fossils proving the existence of transition organisms just hadn't been discovered yet. And this is obviously an evidence for evolution, because if you could find the transition species, then you could literally show how over the course of 100 million, 500 million, billion years, you could show the slow transition and the accumulation of favorable traits over time, and how that would cause species to change slowly over time. Now, we only did 1 million years in our simulation. We're doing 500,000 years in our project. But if it was 100 million years, then it would be even more dramatic change. If it was 500 million years, then even more dramatic change over that time. He was right, because one organism, and going, if you think back to the previous slide that I showed you, the fossil had, that's called the Tiktaalik. The Tiktaalik is an organism that lived on the earth about 375 million years ago. This is before plants. It's believed to be the first animal to begin living a portion of its life on land. So 375 million years ago, all life was in the seas. Everything. There was nothing on land, just rock. But the Tiktaalik is believed to be the first species that said, you know what, I'm going to pop up there on land. I want to check it out. And this is like a model of what the Tiktaalik probably looked like. It's obviously extinct. This recreated image has been produced by just looking at its fossils. And this is Neil Shubin. He's a paleontologist and author. In 2004, he and his team discovered the Tiktaalik. And this video is another one that I'm going to put onto Moodle. It's a really cool video of how they discovered that Tiktaalik. They kind of started by digging into rock and finding the snout or the front nose. And then as they uncovered, they realized they had a really amazing specimen, a fossil specimen. Again, it's made of rock, but it's in the shape of the Tiktaalik. And so another example is and I'm going to butcher this name, I'm going to try it though, the Acanthostega. It appeared on the earth about 365 million years ago, and it's believed to be the first fish to have digits. So here we have our first fish that actually has fingers, and so having fingers was an advantage for this species. And the Tiktaalik kept changing over time into what we have now. And then those species went extinct, but the species that formed from them continued to live on. And this is just kind of a silly thing. I found that if you play Jurassic World, the game, it's a mobile game. I didn't know it was a mobile game. If you play it, then you can level up your Acanthostega up to level 40, and then it becomes purple and blue. Yeah. Didn't know. Like, even Jurassic World had this one. It even has fingers, kind of. Here are some of those species I was talking about. Okay, so coelacanths. Coelacanths are crazy because coelacanths that are in the fossil record as far back as 360 million years, and they are still on the Earth. They are, I'm putting in air quotes, living fossils. They've lived on this Earth forever. Nothing has made them go extinct, at least not yet. So here we can see some of the other organisms. As species went from being living in these rivers, swamps, and shallows, and then as you can see, the higher they go, they end up going out to land. So we have the Tiktaalik 375 million years ago, the Acanthostega 365 million years ago, probably spent a little bit more time on land. The Ichthyostega, even more time on land. And you can see that they kind of slowly but surely became less fish-like and more amphibian-like. They look more like salamanders than they do fish. Okay, that's a lot on fossils. I dumped a lot of information on you, a lot of examples. All you really need to know are that fossils show what organisms look like in the past. And if you know what the organisms look like in the past, then you can clearly see the transition species that show evolution and natural selection as something that is possible. I don't want you to get hung up on all the examples. Don't worry about that. I just thought the more cool examples I can provide to you, the more interested you would be in fossils. So we'll move on to our next evidence, and that's species distribution. And there's this term I'd like you to know, it's biogeography. So biogeography is the study of locations and organisms around the world. And Darwin and Wallace observed animals that seemed related, but adapted to different environments in different regions. And so I'm going to give an example. But before that, I'm going to prepare for a lot of cuteness because we're going to look at a lot of mom and cub, or a lot of mom and baby pictures. It's so cute. The lioness and her cub. There's a good one. We got a polar bear and its cub. Now, if you don't know, polar bears live in Arctic regions in the far north, towards the North Pole. I just have a picture here of North America, and you can see that green region is where polar bears are known to be living. Here's a brown bear and its cub. Brown bears live in similar areas. Now, their habitats have changed over time due to glaciation. So there have been periods where there have been big, huge glaciers, like gigantic slabs of ice that have dipped down into Canada, what is now Canada, and the United States. So you can see that after the glaciers, they lived in all of these regions, but because humans have kind of, colonized a lot of this area, the brown bear, they typically live more up north now in this kind of dark greenish brown color. Canada, Alaska, maybe into northern United States, but they stick to northwestern Canada and Alaska. Why are polar bears and brown bears, why are we looking at those? Well, it's now with DNA evidence, you can see that they were once probably the same species. They have a common ancestor. It says here, estimates of when polar bears began to split from brown bears continue to change. Geneticists look further into polar bear genome. Recent studies suggest that polar bears split from a common brown bear ancestor 350,000 to 6 million years ago. After beginning to branch off from brown bears, the polar bears' ancestors underwent a series of evolutionary changes in order to survive the Arctic. The bears adapted to a life of hunting seals and surviving in extreme cold. One of the most remarkable adaptations was the ability to thrive on a fat-rich diet without apparent heart damage. Interestingly, the research shows that after brown bears and polar bears separated, there were periods when they came into contact again, particularly with polar bear genes flowing into grizzlies. Really, really cool. So they most likely had a common ancestor. Members of the brown bear population split off and moved north. And then over time, they slowly adapted to living in the Arctic. They had to be able to survive the extreme Arctic temperatures. So their fur coats became thicker. and gradually thicker and thicker and thicker until all of them had thick coats. They had to be able to survive on a fat-rich diet. They eat a lot of fish and seal blubber. These have more fats than, say, what the brown bears eat, which brown bears are omnivores. They'll eat anything. They'll eat plants. They'll eat animals. They'll eat everything. Yeah, so a series of evolutionary changes. Now, how long did those changes take? Estimates 350,000 years. That would be a really fast period of time to evolve into a polar bear, but 6 million years ago is very reasonable. So just one more example of polar bears fit their current environment, and brown bears fit their current environment. Obviously, they're related, but over time, natural selection slowly changed them into what they are now to fit their environment. Another great example are wolves. We have the Ethiopian wolf, which is a small red wolf. We have the Arctic wolf, which is a fluffier white wolf. And both of them are descendants from the gray wolves. In fact, gray wolves live pretty much everywhere. The gray wolf appeared into the fossil record about 750,000 years ago. They are everywhere. They live all through Russia and Canada, into the United States, down into the Middle East and parts of Europe. Gray wolves are everywhere. And so it makes sense that over time, a population of gray wolves maybe became isolated and slowly evolved into the Ethiopian wolf, which Ethiopian wolves are smaller. They have thinner coats. They have bigger ears. They hunt smaller prey. So over time, it became beneficial for the wolves of Ethiopia to become a redder color, become their own species. Arctic wolves, which would have lived in the northern parts, they found their own adaptations and took on their own traits. And those traits accumulated into the species they are now. These adaptations of all organisms, they match the environment in which those organisms live. Darwin and Wallace, when they observed organisms, they never found anything that seemed out of place. Everything seems to match its environment. And that's what will happen over hundreds of thousands, millions of years of natural selection. The organism will accumulate traits that allow it to survive in its environment. Now, if its environment changes quickly, then that organism is probably in trouble. That's why climate change is such a big deal. That's why if you look back 66 million years ago when the dinosaurs went extinct, a gigantic 10-kilometer wide city-sized meteor hit the Earth. That changed the climate for not only dinosaurs, but everything living on the planet. And if the environment changes quickly, then maybe the organisms will not have time to adapt fast enough. But if the environment doesn't change, and slowly but surely adaptations will accumulate through natural selection, and the species can survive. It's a really cool thing. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have about these two pieces of evidence, fossils and species distribution. I find them to be incredibly interesting. But that's where we stop. If there are no questions, good for the cause. I have a question for you. So you were supposed to have a spirit animal. It was last week. Hopefully you know what your spirit animal was. So how does the biogeography of your animal make sense? So think about your animal, think about where it lives. Just write a sentence or two about how your species that you chose matches its environment, what adaptations allow it to live. There's no complaining. You're not the ostrich. The ostrich is in a really bad spot. But if you don't have any more questions, if you have any questions, just let me know when I return, and I will see you guys soon.